15 years ago, 2004. The benches are downstairs, the shot show, as you can see. So she came, I've heard her speak a few times, and Sarah was in a class at Midrash that she taught, so she's somebody that many of my friends were in her class and know her. Unlike the Rambam or the other people we studied in this series, she's somebody who a number of us have met, and she's still alive and still writing. I don't know if you know the website academia.edu. Is that a thing? It's sort of like Facebook for academics. I think actually Facebook bought it. It's a website where if you're an academic, you have your page where you post your CV and you just post your articles and excerpts from your books, and it's a way for scholars to share their scholarship with others who are interested in reading it, and you can follow, you're like...
One more time the name?
It's on the sheet, academia.edu. It's really neat. So you can follow Tamar, you can follow half a dozen or 100 other scholars, and then every time they post an article to their page, you can see it. If they bookmark somebody else's article that they're reading, you can find that out too. So it's like a social media kind of platform for academia. So it's kind of neat. So she posted her CV there, and she posted lots and lots of articles, which was very distracting to me when I should have been focused on printing the source sheet. I was reading a whole bunch of other things that she wrote and reading her CV. Again, so that was the risk. But it's a cool website, and you can, if they think of somebody in scholarship who interests you, any of the people we've studied, people who've written, secondary scholars we've encountered, you can follow them on that website. Okay, so she's from America, she's from Detroit. She made Aliyah as a teenager in 1954, and she went to study at Hebrew University, where she got her BA in 1960, her MA in 1978. That's a bit of a gap. I think the 7 children explain part of that gap between her BA and her MA. And then her PhD in 1987, which is also a bit of a gap. So what was her dissertation? Moral philosophy and the writings of Rabbi Cilantro's disciples in the Musar movement. So the Musar movement was one of her first subjects, but if you look at her master's dissertation, it was on Rav Kook. So that was 2 of her areas of expertise, her academic training of Kook and the Musar movement. The Musar movement was a movement of ethical introspection that spread in Lithuanian yeshivas in the late 19th, early 20th century. Interesting topic. We should study Rabbi Cilantra would be another interesting person to examine in this series. All the academic positions are there, listed, a whole bunch of them. And then the non-academic positions, among most important, she still teaches at Midrash Lindenbaum, which is the first Israeli institution under Beit Midrash for women, in which Talmud is studied at in a sort of rigorous, high-level fashion. It was founded by Rabbi Chaim Bravender, I think around 1976, around that time, and still exists today. She teaches Jewish thought there, philosophy and stuff like that, and so she continues. She's still on the faculty there. That was the context where Sarah was her student. So Sarah was at Midrash Lindenbaum in 97, 98, that academic year. Sarah was in Midrash Lindenbaum, and she studied with Tamar along with everyone else there. Okay, and you can see the other places where she's taught. 2005, she came to Chovevei Torah. I was a student at Chovevei Torah that year, and she taught an optional philosophy class, which I didn't take, but she was there. 1997, the first JOFA conference, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, has a big conference in 1997. It's this lavishly funded conference at a fancy Manhattan hotel. There are, hundreds, maybe thousands of people there, scholars, speakers from all over the world. People it tapped into this incredibly exciting energy. I'm pretty sure I was there too. I think I heard her lecture, or if I recall, I think I heard her lecture because Sarah had told me that Tamar she's one of my teachers, so she's lecturing at this JOFA conference that I was going to as a high school senior, so I went as well, and I heard that lecture, and it was. I found it really exhilarating, really interesting ideas, really new ideas. The kernel of this book was in that lecture that she gave. And it was the first time she'd ever addressed any issues of feminism. It's not her field is Rav Kook and Rabbi Cilantra, the Musar movement, and Jewish philosophy, Maimonides. That's what she taught at Midrash Lindenbaum. Not feminist thinking. That was not something that was core to her her scholarship. The next year, she's invited to give a paper at the Orthodox Forum. I think I've described the Orthodox Forum before. If you've been in her home, we have that shelf of red books. Those are the Orthodox Forum books. Every year, starting in the early 90s, I think, the Yeshiva University has convened a group of the modern Orthodox intelligentsia to come and discuss some topic. And the topic could be the religious significance of the State of Israel, or the topic could be rabbinic authority, or and personal autonomy, some core idea at the heart of modern Orthodox life. And they have, they invite, all of the leading intellectuals of our community to come and to this conference, and half a dozen of them or a dozen of them write papers. The papers are shared in advance. Everyone comes to the conference, they talk about the papers, and then a year or two later, they get around to publishing a book of all those papers. And many of them are now online, but we have the shelf. There are 2 years they stopped making them red. They made them black, and then they went back to the red book. So now they're red again. The conferences I don't think happen every year anymore, but whenever occasionally when they have the funding, they still happen. So that year, the topic was some issue related to women and feminism. That was the topic itself. And Tamar Ross was invited to give a paper. She gave a version of the talk she had given at the Jofa conference, and the reaction was so negative in a way that totally stunned her, because I think she thought that she was going to an academic conference, and in a sense she was, but she was also going to this annual gathering of the modern Orthodox intelligentsia, and people really lit into her and said very harshly critical things about her theology and the thinking that she said. And somebody said, I don't even, maybe that's Rav Kook's ideas that she's saying. If so, he's a heretic also, I don't care. What she said is totally, not acceptable. And it was, I think personally, kind of surprising to her and very unsettling and hurtful. Some of the people have subsequently apologized for the way that things were said, but nonetheless, she really touched a nerve. And they never published a book from that year, because they couldn't publish the book with her paper because it had been condemned so conclusively by all of the leadership of our community. How could they publish her paper on a Yeshiva University imprint? And they couldn't publish it and not include her paper, so they just didn't publish any of the papers that year. They skipped a year in the Orthodox Forum. So that was and that also kind of further pushed her to kind of think through some of these issues and what's going on here. 2004, that paper, she published it eventually elsewhere, and then she expanded into a book, which was published in 2004. Also, I read two, one kind of respectful reviews with some critical comments, and then also some very, very harshly negative reviews of the book were published also, and there was a whole, back in 2004, 2005, a whole little polemic about the book. 2016, she has another book out called Constructing Faith, which is all about sort of a postmodern approach to religion and what is meant by the truth claims of a religion, and that's a book I have not read. I actually didn't know it existed until I saw it on her CV. So, what are her ideas? And again, I'm not. Again, I don't feel fully as well prepared as I wanted to be to kind of share over her ideas, but I'll do the best I can. And again, you can. The truth is, on academia.edu, you can get some some of these public lectures she gave. They're there, and so it's very accessible, relatively short kind of expositions of her worldview. So if it interests you, and the thought of reading a book is a little bit daunting, you can read an article where she, some of these are where the tamtzit, the essence of these ideas are shared. So let's start just to identify what are some of the kind of critical issues facing Orthodox feminism. Okay, the Orthodox, I'm not going to, defining feminism, let's say, as the radical belief that women are people, and Orthodoxy, let's say we don't have to define in this setting. So let's sort of just generate. What are some of the issues facing? What's the agenda? What's the Orthodox feminist agenda? Aguna, right? There are these women who are trapped in dead marriages because Jewish law gives husbands the ability to withhold a Jewish divorce from their wives even after the marriage is over. Good. That's a big one. Yes?
Equal participation within the bounds of halal.
Ritual participation in synagogue, public, minyan, stuff like that, or
in ritual life.
Minyan,
in
lulav, you want to tell somebody, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
In ritual life, but also within the general functioning of a shul and a community.
What do you, can you say what you mean with that? Like, just for example.
Aliyahs?
No, not necessarily that, so much as the ability of women to participate on the board,
Yeah,
to be
like
president of the
leadership, power, leadership,
Mhm.
exercising leadership, influencing the shape of the community.
the space to have something like a women's mincha within.
Yeah, that the shul, that good. The women's religious needs should be high on the communal agenda and respect in the communal agenda. That women should have decision-making power within Orthodox communal life. Good, and that's distinct from issues about minyan, aliyah, the Torah, lulav, whatever the mitzvah, like actual halachic stuff about ritual. Yeah.
I was going to abstract the mitzvah issue, the tension between what is one is obligated to do and what is permissible to do.
Yeah.
I mean, just because you're not obligated, does that mean you're not allowed?
Yeah.
And so forth. So that as a category of thought rather than the specifics of a particular ritual.
Yeah, good. So like why, right. So for example, like 1,000 years ago already, the Rabbi in Germany writes that, even though women are exempt, they don't have to fulfill the mitzvah shofar. Already he noticed, like, women take this mitzvah really seriously, and we have to make sure as a community that we accommodate that commitment on the part of our community's women to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar, even though it's a mitzvah just like shofar, just like lulav and sukkah, that women are exempt technically, right? On the other hand, tzitzit is a mitzvah that women are exempt from, and in most Orthodox communities would look askance at would look at a woman who shows up in a talit, let's say, right? I mean, It's tefillin. Every Orthodox community will look askance at women in tefillin, right? That's its own unique issue, for sure. Absolutely great. So there's a ritual participation, right? In terms of like why are women excluded from mitzvah that the Torah says they're not obligated to, or the rabbinic tradition says they're not obligated to perform. I think minyan has symbolism about counting in a community, about being able to comprise a community. It's a form of citizenship. What else? How about religious leadership? How about exercising religious authority and religious leadership in terms of being a Torah scholarship and, like I say, access to Torah scholarship and a career path as a Torah scholar, as a teacher of Torah, and actually in some sort of rabbinic capacity. We would call rabbinic capacity like something like issuing halachic guidance, providing halachic guidance, providing psak halacha, and then that's one. And then the ancillary issues of what could a career framework look like for a woman who wanted to go down that, right? Again, I'm not saying that every individual who call him or herself an Orthodox feminist would care about all of these agenda items. I'm just trying to generate like a broad list of what could be on the agenda of Orthodox women. Okay, that's so. I don't want to implicate anyone in any of these particular ideas. It's touchy, right?
How about women? Is the word posek?
Posek, yeah, that's what I was referring to. Posek, a halachic scholar, yeah. Someone who's giving a like good. Anything else? Anything else that I not included?
Initiate divorce and that sort of.
Yeah, that sort of Maryland was sort of saying, like the divorce laws are, initiate, marriage also initiate marriage, right? It's a halachic marriage. Kedushin is affair. The woman doesn't, she has to consent, right? But she indicates that by, she just puts her hand out, right? Doesn't have to. That's and accepts her ring. Okay, so. Tamar Ross began, she noticed that these kinds of, some of these are issues that kind of like they're grading. Maybe there's like a liturgical, maybe it's demeaning or it's experiences demeaning. Some of these issues are actually like people really suffer. Like Navina is really suffering, right? And why, she wondered, are these issues so fraught for our community? Why, or even in the innocent days of 1997, back in the bygone era when everyone got along, but no, like even in 1997, there was a lot of discord in the Orthodox community that had been going on for a decade or more in the modern Orthodox community about some of these issues that had, already then was pulling our community apart. That lines were being drawn between who was in and who was out, and the community was being defined around some of these issues that were like women's issues were like definitional, where boundaries were being drawn around these issues, and decade after decade, the Agunah crisis wasn't solved. And there didn't seem to be kind of ready solutions to some of the other items on this Orthodox feminist agenda. There's still, 1997, there was not a single post-secondary yeshiva for women under Orthodox auspices in the United States. And that was decades after the Soloveitchik taught the first Gemara Shir to women at Stern College. There was no, nothing existed, right? So why? So I think like maybe the core idea that was to recognize that these issues were so hard, as opposed to like challenging issues in, medical halakha and, like fertility treatments and industrial kashrut, where like problems arise and we solve them, right? How do the modern, the factory where Oreo cookies are made, looks nothing like, your Zadie's, bakery. But somehow the OU was able to go in there and make it kosher, which requires a lot of it's a lot of new materials and new food, complicated, sophisticated food science and industrial knowledge had to be known, and chemistry, et cetera, and they were able to do it. We solved that problem, right? And the state of Israel has been able to solve issues about, building a modern country and observing Shabbat and the army and hospitals, et cetera, We solved those problems. Why did these problems not get solved? And her suggestion was that these problems don't get solved was because they necessarily raise much bigger questions that are really, really unsettling and have no simple answers. And that's sort of, I guess, what the book is sort of about. Like what are the bigger questions that the feminist challenge raises that are not just pragmatic questions, that we can't just be solved pragmatically. So just a few, I did manage a few just, in the courses she goes through this building up her argument. Source one, we'll read a few of these together. The pages are things that I wanted to photocopy or write out, I didn't, so I'll read them. So first she talks about source one, just, as she's describing the history of some responses, like what are the failed attempts or what are the attempts that are for her not fully satisfying. So you'll find some apologetics in the Orthodox community will say things like, I'm sure you've heard, women are more spiritual than men, they don't need things like, Talmud Torah and Minyan and all those mitzvot because they're innately on this higher spiritual plane, and right? I don't mean to be mocking. I'm a little bit mocking, but I don't mean to be. My tone is maybe more mocking than I mean to be, a little bit, right? I'm sure you've encountered that kind of that version of apologetics, and what?
It's very patronizing.
It's very patronizing. Yeah, patronizing because it say more.
It's patronizing because it looks at women and says, we know you want to, but in our opinion, you don't need it.
Yeah, right. So it's right. It's right. That's extremely patronizing because it's some authority figure kind of saying, if you knew what was good for you, you wouldn't want to do all these silly things and copy the men because you'd realize that what you have is so much better or so much. And there's a sense that it's disingenuous. I don't know. I feel that it's that. And I don't want to impute people's motives either, but there's a sense that it's. This is a bad analogy. I don't like it, but I'll say it anyway. This doesn't quite right. I know it came to my mind. It's like, so you'll say that, in like a capitalist system, hard work is rewarded with, greater income, and that's the sort of people who work the hardest and with the most diligence, they rise to the top economically, and that's our market economy. But if that were entirely true, then you would find someone who would say, I'm burned out from my job as an iBanker. Just these 80, I can't do it anymore. I'm going to go mine coal for a couple of years to relax a little bit. I'll become a lumberjack, to relax a little bit, and because it's too much for me to be, So no one, so this. We say certain things, right, to kind of justify a certain hierarchy, but we don't actually. If we really believed it, then we would act differently. That's sort of why that's the analogy, right? If we really believed the kind of apologetics that we say to justify a certain hierarchy, we would, and we followed through, then you would find, people like iBankers, becoming lumberjacks because they wanted to wrestle,
There's also the added element that people are saying this to women while simultaneously not accepting them as sources of halachic authority, as leaders, not letting not giving them a space to
Yeah,
speak
if it were really
up
true that women
and
were in a higher
fully
spiritual plane, didn't
participate.
need all these things, then wouldn't you be like finding other ways to tap into their,
Yes.
like refined spiritual characters for public leadership roles, rather than say it's a higher spiritual plane that can only be manifest in a domestic environment, which is a little bit right. That's sort of strange. The other thing about it is that it's entirely, almost entirely fabricated and new. Like that's the piece. Apologetics, just means the defense of religion. There's nothing wrong with apologetics, but in some apologetics, like if the answer is there before the question, then that's a sign that maybe this is like legitimate and authentic. But when nobody, before modern apologetics ever said, to my knowledge, women are on a higher spiritual plane, and that's why they don't need all these extra minutes. That's not a traditional Jewish belief, to my knowledge. That's something that somebody invented in the 20th century as an apologetic argument in response to feminist critiques of traditional religion. I'm fairly certain that's true. I mean, you can find a state, I don't want to be, I think that's 85% true. That's a fabricated modern ideology, and it's quite radical, and a radical kind of reevaluation. No, minyan, Torah study, like Gemara learning. No, those things aren't really important. What's really important is like saying the Shema with your kids in bed, and that's what's really, really important. Not any, So that's kind of a radical, in the name of preserving the status quo, we're embracing a sort of very innovative and radical kind of philosophy that is not an ancient Jewish perspective. That's first one, right? The mystic apologists are more deeply conservative in practice and pose less of a threat to the status quo. Nevertheless, a theology that strives to insulate a female rationale in place of a religiosity whose forms are predominantly male-centered and that elevates women's role in the home above men's activity in the communal realm is, in an important sense, more radical and innovative than a theology that strives merely to give women an equal share in the religion as currently conceived. The popularity of this literature is an indication of how successful it is in addressing a genuinely felt need. Okay, so she's not dismissing it out of hand, but she's noting that, including women in the religion that exists and kind of giving women more access to the actual rituals of trees as it currently exists in a certain sense is much less radical than kind of creating a new religion in which all those things aren't all that important, and that women have their own religious lives. That's. On the other hand, it is true that women weren't, at least for many certain times and places, women were not active in, say, the synagogue or the Beit Midrash in those particular spheres, and they were sustaining Judaism and living lives of spiritual authenticity and beauty. So I think they must have thought something about their own religious lives, and we don't have much access to it because they didn't write books by and large, so we don't have access to it. But nonetheless, I think your critique is still there. There is something kind of radical and almost about kind of building up an edifice of this other religion for women that is parallel to the religion that we know about, which takes place in synagogue and in the Beit Midrash and is documented in the halachic literature. Sound fair? Yes. No? Okay. So then another attempt. So that's one attempt she finds ultimately unsatisfying to respond to this critique of feminism. Another attempt is the attempt of legal formalism. This is the approach of let's say, that I presented last week, or Soloveitchik's halachic man, where the halacha is independent a priori, exists pristine, disconnected from the rest of the world, and is applied to the world, etc. Right? Many of us were here last week. We talked about that, and that's another. That's another attempt to maybe that's a very powerful tool, maybe to solve some of these. Because you could say, look, technically there's no, for example, women's zimun, 3 women eat a meal together. The halacha says they're obligated to make a zimun, to invite one another to recite Birkat Hamazon, just as a group of men do.
That's what I try to tell them on the cruise ship, because we had two.
Tell whom?
We had 2 men at the table, and I don't know, 4 or 5 women.
Yeah.
And no, we'll say it ourselves.
Okay, so according to some positions, that is, there was an obligation that you had to recite a zimun. According to some other opinions, it was merely an optional, or a shoot, to do so. So, but so I think certainly it's a good thing to do, and that's an example of expanded ritual opportunity for women, coming from a straightforward, just read the law. It's what does it say? You don't have to. Doesn't matter what your social context is. Doesn't matter who your friends are. Just the law is the law. It tells you what to do, and the law tells three women who eat a meal together they should say create a zimun, right? And so there's certain problems that can solve, but she also finds it unsatisfying. I think that's because sometimes it leads you to places that communities really won't allow you to go, which suggests that maybe this is really not how we're thinking about halakha to begin with. For example, source 2, a woman whose notions of religiosity are derived from the logic of the codified text, unmediated by the filter of lived tradition, may well be led to fresh conclusions that fly in the face of traditionally accepted norms. Such a woman might in all sincerity be convinced that donning tefillin, considered more radical and problematic than talit, is the most reasonable consequence of her voluntary commitment to recite the prayer of Shema, which prescribes that God's words be a mark on the arm and the forehead. This line of reasoning is arguably far more compelling, despite its novelty for women, than is abstinence simply because the practice was unheard of in earlier generations. Without the conditioning of the generations of women who found their spirituality in the running of their homes and rearing of their children, such women, I think, may genuinely believe in the halachic superiority of her consistent stance. There are no easy distinctions between content-free halachic zeal and the incorporations of ideals foreign to Judaism under the pretext of religious fervor. So this distinction which halachic man needs to make between the pure, a priori, pristine halakha and the world that it's applied to, that distinction, in fact, breaks down. And this is like the postmodern critique of modernism, okay? Halachic man, is an epitome of this modern way of seeing the world, right? We're going to use logic and scientific rationality to impose this order on the universe. And the postmodernists say, this distinction between you and the universe, not so clear, not so fast, okay? Who are you? Where are you standing, Mr. Halachic man? Where you can be separate entirely from the world, so that you can apply your halachic judgment upon the world. That's a significant postmodern insight. Also, that's an insight of postmodern science, if you will. That's quantum physics, right? Where this whole the whole scientific endeavor of the objective observer studying the world, quantum physics collapses that distinction because it's crazy, but it's true, right? By observing something, you necessarily change it, right? At a subatomic level, light is a particle or a wave. It's both, and it's a particle and a wave. It's a particle or a wave, and depending on how you observe it and how you study it, it behaves like a particle. It behaves like a wave. And there's no way to study, right, or a subatomic particle, you can know its velocity, but not its location, or its right? So it's the thing that you choose to study, just the act of studying it and focusing, you're then impacting how it is acting in the world. And so this distinction, the whole stance of objectivity is lost in quantum physics, and postmodernism recognizes that's true as well for applying for religion and for law. So a woman could say, she reads the sources and she comes to the conclusion as the halachic woman, she reads the sources and I should wear tefillin. That's the clear-cut implication. As a woman, I'm exempt from the mitzvah to recite the Shema, but I do so anyway, and that's everyone likes that. If I'm going to say the Shema, I should wear tefillin. And look at the Talmud, and I see that the Talmud has a number of stories of pious women who wore tefillin, and the majority of the Rishonim treat those stories at face value. Michal wore tefillin, and Chachamim were approved of that. But show up in shul wearing tefillin, and not our shul, where we don't look askance at anyone, but right, you'll be. You could. I know women who have tried this at their friendly local Orthodox synagogues, and they're not so friendly anymore. They've been told to leave, and even with good reason, because that's against the norms of our community, and it makes the other worshipers feel uncomfortable. And our community, we have that's not how we do things. And you want to do that, do it in your own privacy of your home. Don't come to our synagogue where we don't do things that way. and men, why do you even want to do that anyway? Like that's you're under the influence of feminism. That's an outside ideology. That's pushing you to do this. That's not straight. But no, it's straight halakha. I'm the halakhic woman. I'm not. There's no ideology. It's just my right. So that distinction is because it breaks down, because you can never separate yourself from your surroundings. There is no Archimedean point, right? Archimedes, the Greek, so he said, if I could move the earth with a stick, if I had a place to stand, right? So, right, meaning, right, you could just, right? But where there's no place to stand, you can't get off the earth to move it, right? You can't, halachic man, halachic woman can't extricate themselves from the world to then apply this pristine halachic framework upon the world. And so this distinction of what's straightforward halakha and what's, norms and practices that emerge from a community, how do you make that distinction? So she finds that wanting as well. What she ends up coming to say is that therefore we have to she embraces a sort of a legal theory that's associated with people like Robert Cover, who was an American legal theorist, but who was actually heavily influenced by Judaism and by the Torah, which, and the relationship between law and narrative. And it's kind of interesting. In the Torah, it's interesting. You have mitzvot in the Torah that relate to stories in the Torah in certain interesting ways. Like the Torah says, if you have a man who has two wives and his children from his two wives, and he's not allowed to privilege the son of the beloved wife over the son of the hated wife, just like Yaakov Avinu didn't. Okay, right. So it seems that there's a relationship between the stories in the Torah and the laws of the Torah kind of existing in an interesting dialogue where the law is correcting the stories and the stories are shaping the laws. And Dr. Ross is saying that this law comes from or emerges from a community that finds certain ideas plausible and certain ideas not plausible, and that consciousness of the community and the story it tells itself about itself and who they are and their identity, that shapes how law is applied. And therefore go ahead.
Does she include some temporal component? So is the values of community change over time?
Yes, exactly.
An interpretation
Exactly. So
that's why you can't operate as the halachic man would.
Can't hear you.
what? Say it again.
And that's one of the reasons that you can't operate as the halachic man would.
Because there is no because halacha doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's like there's 20th century halachic man and there's 21st century halachic man, and they're gonna
17th century.
17th century. Yes, exactly. So I often say how could you interpret
but no, there isn't.
Why?
There isn't. In theory, at least, there should be one halachic man who can apply the halacha in any time that he lives, except that the rest of the community doesn't operate like that. The rest of the community is affected by the.
Why isn't halachic man himself affected in the same way? How can the that's the halachic man can't step out of him. People have, and I say, look, it's to interpret Torah, to provide halachic guidance explicitly as a postmodern 21st century American. So how can you do that? Well, what option do I have? I can't interpret Torah as a 17th century Pole or a 19th century Lithuanian. I can only interpret Torah as a 21st century American. Like that, I don't know.
That's your reality.
That's not reality. That's who I am. That's part of that. The instrument that's doing the halachic judgment is itself is embodied in a time and a place and a context.
But the essence of halacha is anachronistic, in the sense that every generation, successive generation, is viewed as being further from the source of truth rather than going towards it.
Amazing.
So progressive development of law is precisely the antithesis of the traditional and contemporary traditionalist argumentatively anachronistic.
Good.
definition.
We could have written the book. Okay. She argues precisely that. So I say two things. First of all, because it's the community's self-understanding and the narrative of the community and et cetera, that's why it's so important for Orthodox feminists to stay in the game. And that's the power, she says, of Orthodox, because where she differs from Rachel Adler and some of and Judith Plaskow and the non-Orthodox Jewish feminists, because by saying, no, we're faithful to the Torah and we're faithful to halakha and we're going to stay in the game and be part of the community, but also we know these truths about ourselves and who we are and what our values are and how we see the world, that's the force that pushes Torah forward, that expands the palace of Torah to encompass these new conceptions. If we just walk away, then the Torah is not expanded. But I think it's a metaphor. I think that comes from Rav Kook's writing. Like expanding the palace of Torah, new rooms, new vistas, new concepts can be conquered by the Torah, included in the Torah, and that's precisely, again, Orthodox feminists who have that power, by holding tight to those two truths. And she says explicitly that she rejects a kind of traditionalist, concept of revelation, that it was once and forever, and she embraces what she calls a cumulative form of revelation. This is what was so upsetting to everyone at the Orthodox Forum, right? That a cumulative revelation where God speaks to us and perpetually, and this new awareness that we as a community of faithful, believing, practicing Jews, these new awarenesses we get, but that is God's continuing cumulative revelation. Yes, so the Torah, because you can't, she rejects some of these earlier also attempts to, like Eliezer Berkowitz and Judith Hauptman and some of these other thinkers, more liberal halachic thinkers who have, who tried to say, the essence of the Torah is more embracing of women, and just, you have these like kind of bad elements there that, the patriarchy goes to the very, very core of the Torah. It doesn't just jump in the Middle Ages. It's not a strand in Chazal that gets amplified. It's like it's there from the very beginning. It's at the core of Torah Moshe. It's there, but in some ways informed by Maimonides and also Rav Kook. But the Torah that Moshe received had to be accessible and comprehensible to a ancient Near East that was embracing patriarchy. So of course the Torah was patriarchal because it was given to people who were living in that mindset, embracing that mindset, and the Torah therefore had to speak to them in their mindset at that time. But that wasn't meant to be the final pinnacle of human existence. It was a channeling or a leap forward for. I think this is. I think you see this. I think many of us would see this. Or be more comfortable with this type of argument concerning something like Rambam, for example, says the korbanot, the sacrificial rites in the Torah. Rambam says, God doesn't need sacrifices. What are they for? So every religion worth its salt, back in that time, they had sacrifices. If the Torah didn't have sacrifices, we would have said to God, this is a weird religion, we don't want it, no thanks, right? If it doesn't have sacrifices, what kind of religion is this? So the Torah has sacrifices, not because God wants it, but because that was necessary for us back then. Torah, those of you who were sitting in the first row and heard the Rebbe Tzavoy, right? Last Shabbos. The Torah includes laws of slavery. What's so great about slavery? Why is it? Slavery was part of every human society. So the Torah limits it and elevates it and restricts it in certain ways, but not that slavery is a pinnacle of human existence or something good. The Eshet Yifat Torah, the woman who's captured in battle, and she, it's a machloket if she can be raped once or twice, or, and how do you marry her? What? So Rashi says, Dibra Torah Kneged Leitzah. The Torah here is not giving you, not telling you what to do. The Torah is just trying to, mitigate harm. Harm reduction here. It's like the methadone treatment, harm reduction. It's a needle program. It's harm reduction, mitigating the harm, rather than, telling us the ideal way that we're supposed to act. These are slightly nuances between those ideas, but patriarchy is there in the Torah, not because that's the form of human interaction that is the fullest expression of God's wishes for us, but because the Torah was given back then in a time and place, and now we're in a different time and different place, and we have new ways of understanding things, and that also, like the Torah expands to include these new insights, which are also, she says, that is also a divine revelation. Yeah.
Would she say that, say, 500 years from now, the world develops into a place where, reverts to a place, to a society where patriarchy is the dominant force and the dominant ideal?
Yeah.
Would women lose those obligations?
That's so interesting, and it's a very good question. I think, and it's not only a good question on her, that's actually a really good question on Rev Kook. Because Rev Kook, who, his messianic, Zionist, universalist, mystic worldview, Hegelian worldview was, history is sort of this godly idea, manifesting through history, and history is progressing and getting better, and there's the thesis and the antithesis and the synthesis, which is this, et cetera, and we're just moving forward and progressing, and he thought World War I was this cataclysmic, wiping away the old and the dross and all this, sort of the negative, baggage of a dying civilization. It was paving the way for, the redemption of Israel and the redemption of the world. Right? He writes, now we're returning to Eretz Yisrael when we won't have to fight wars anymore. Right? We gave up. We left, the national playing field, because in this dark ages that have we would have had to fight and use the sword in order to maintain our freedom like every other nation, and so we gave up our freedom. We didn't want to have to fight. And now that war is ending, now we're returning to Eretz Yisrael, we're regaining our independence when we won't have to fight. Right? So his whole theory of history was predicated on this notion of progress and advancement, which was only tenable because he died in 1935. Right?
Part of that was following the wisdom of the time.
Yeah, people thought that. No, Rav Kook was the only one who thought that that was the war to end all wars. That's not Rav Kook's phrase. He didn't invent that, right? That's not him. So I think that's very interesting. And I would say. Just reading this in 2017 versus 1997. 1997 was just after, what's his name? The end of history. It was
Toynbee.
No. In 1991, Fukuyama, right? After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a philosopher, historian, Fukuyama, Francis Fukuyama, okay? The end of history is a political and philosophical concept that supposes that a particular political, economic, or social system may develop that would... So he felt, 1992, The End of History and the Last Man is a 1992 book by Francis Fukuyama expanding on his 1989 essay, The End of History, published in the International Affairs Journal, The National Interest. What did he say? So after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he said, history's over. There's sort of the liberal democracy is the only ideology that can appeal to humanity. History is over now. For centuries, right, this ideology, this political system, this worldview was on the ascendancy, and it defeated monarchy, and it defeated the old empires, and it defeated fascism, and it defeated communism, and there is no other ideology that competes for the hearts of humanity, and it's just so history's over now, right? This was a serious idea in 1989, right? And he published the book in 1992, and she gave this lecture in 1997, and right. So 20 years later, not so fast, right? I'd say liberal democracy is not quite as, assured. Its role is a little more precarious than we once thought. And I'd say sort of this ever, expanding, ethos of equality and egalitarianism and working to overcome patriarchy, I'd say, is also very much a more precarious place now than men. So that's a very long answer to a very good question. So I don't know. So the other piece I'll say, based on this idea of cumulative revelation, she also then says that this therefore allows for orthodoxy to embrace biblical criticism when we find that compelling, because we're not really challenged by a Torah that develops in time over a historical period, because that's our theology. Our theology actually is that our reception of God's direction, God's wisdom, is something that proceeds over time, over generations. And so if the Torah came together also over a period of generations, centuries even, that shouldn't really fundamentally challenge our stance as those who embrace the Torah and follow the Torah. So this also brought her into, needless to say, this was also incredibly controversial. But she says, whether you accept it, this is implicit in being a Jewish woman who cares about the feminist agenda. You're saying the ways that my mother and my grandmother, the answers that were good for them are not good for me. And and she pushes into, and the implications of that are therefore this, and the reason why everyone is so resistant to responding to those questions are because it has much wider implications for what we think of as law, and how law develops, how Jewish law develops, and also the nature of revelation itself. So this is why everyone got so upset. And yeah. So I just say one, so reactions to that before, it's a lot, sorry. It's a lot. I think one piece where I think she is most subject to criticism, or I think sort of fair can be fairly criticized, is her, her use of gender essentialism in her. So when discussing the patriarchal core that can't be separated out from Torah Moshe. And she said, she talks about, there's the Torah in heaven, right? There's the Torah that's black fire and white fire that preceded the universe, and then there's the Torah that came down into the world that was, committed to paper, to parchment, and that was handed to Moshe, and that which is necessarily going to be a finite, more limited vision of that expansive Torah, and that finite Torah has to be patriarchal because, again, that's to whom it was given, and that's how it came into the world. In the examples, or in the way in which she describes the elements of patriarchy in the Torah and in contemporary Jewish discourse, halachic discourse, she uses some sort of gender, a certain, the whole ethos of hierarchy is masculine, and a certain, that the commandedness is a masculine stance, and that feminine stance is, like men command and receive commandments, and women are consensus building, and there's certain, which is a trope you'll find in certain feminist literature, that that there are kind of gendered ways of thinking about things like law and et cetera, and that to me seems. I find that a little bit weak. Some of that gender essentialist. I think that is to me that's a weak point in certain feminist thinking, and it's in her book as well, in her writing as well, that there are kind of essential characteristics of men and women, or essential male and female characteristics, and that therefore a feminist agenda will include noticing that and reevaluating that, and sort of bringing that feminine perspective, and to me it harkens almost back to the apologetics of the women are there's a similarity that makes me very nervous when the kind of as I'm saying this, there's this Haredi woman who is really into feminist theory. She's an academic in Israel. I can't think of her name. She published a book. She's doing this in a more. She is kind of embracing this, I think, in a much more intellectually rigorous way, and trying to kind of develop like a Kabbalistic feminist theology. But she's very well read in feminist theory, unlike the apologeticists who kind of dabble in like will drop a name drop, a feminist thinker, to make an apologetic point. This woman is very, very well read in feminist theory and also very well read in Kabbalah, and she argues, she sort of does this, I think, in an authentic, more rigorous, deep way. I find more compelling. I find the whole essentialist agenda to be very suspect, or I have a suspicion towards it. I think men and women are probably more similar than my inclination is that men and women are more similar than different, and about most things that matter. And so I have some suspicion about some of these theories that are rooted in kind of essentialist assumptions, whether they're arch conservative essentialist arguments, or whether it's very progressive feminist theory essentialist assumptions. Okay, I think we'll pause here. I didn't give you a lot of quotes. I have pages in her book. If you go, but again, there's some very brief article, relatively brief articles you can read, in which she kind of gives an essence of some of her ideas, which you can find on her academia.edu website. The book, is available. The shul has a copy, which I'm happy to lend to you. Meaning I have a copy in my office, which I guess belongs to the shul, which I can lend to you. And there may be another copy on the bookshelf in the library here. And I think it's definitely worth your time to read it or read part of it. Okay, so thank you so much. Next week, we're not meeting because it's Shavuot. The week after that, Rabbi Brand is speaking from the Torah Mitzion Kollel. His topic is going to be the pursuit of happiness in Jewish thought. So
On Wednesday?
yes, Wednesday maybe, we're skipping a week. We're skipping a week, and it's going to be Wednesday the 12th, whatever that's
The 7th?
No, sorry. Next Wednesday is the 31st. That's Shavuot. The Wednesday after that is the 7th. We are skipping the 7th. And the Wednesday, the 14th, Rabbi Brand is going to be teaching.
Okay, you don't know about this yet, but they return.
Oh, good.
The presentation on the 21st.
Fantastic.
It'll be synagogues of Chicago.
Oh, cool. Great. Fantastic. Oh, good. I'm glad that worked out. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay. And, all right. So, thank you. Good night. Yeah.
On a complete